Thanks, Sudhir, for giving me the chance to talk with you. Yeah, my name is Finnian Gerety. Call me Finn. I'm a senior research fellow in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford in England. And I'm just moved to Oxford to take up a position as principal investigator on a research project on mantras, and that's called Mantras in Religion, Media, and Society in Global Southern Asia. Mantrams for short. So I came to the World Sanskrit Conference to share my research and to learn what other colleagues are working on and to bring some attention and put the word out about this new project that we're developing pertaining to mantras in India, in South Asia, and to some extent around the world. Yeah, there wasn't one like lightning strike moment. I'd say for me it was more gradual because one thing to know about me is that I come from a family of academics. And so when I was like your age or a little younger, I thought academia is so silly. You know, people just studying in libraries and then just teaching other people to become academics and then teaching other people. Like it seemed like this circle, you know, and also it seemed kind of divorced from real life, you know. So my passion was rock and roll music. So I love to sing, I love to play guitar, but I was always a good student because my parents gave me a good education and I was so lucky to have that. So I always had a little bit of like this conflict in myself, right? The rock and roll side and then the A+ student side. And so the reason I'm telling you this is because it has something to do with why I eventually have made a career in studying Sanskrit and the history of Hinduism and the history of religion. One of the things I was very good at in school was ancient languages. And so in the US, as in other places in Europe and the UK, if you study classics, you study Latin and Greek, right? But no Asian classics, right? It's all just kind of very Eurocentric. So when I got to college, I went to Harvard College when I was 18. And I was already pretty educated in Latin and Greek, but I heard about Sanskrit. It's also an Indo-European language. It's related to Latin and Greek, and many Orientalists and Indologists and people who have studied Sanskrit also had a background in European classics. So I thought to myself, okay, I'm here at school, I'm good at ancient languages, let me try something new. And so that was the beginning for me of studying Sanskrit. It was more just to kind of add another language and another discipline to the study of the ancient past. But I didn't really know why I was interested in it. It was almost like, you know, when you're kind of good at something, you kind of take to it naturally, but you don't really think about it. But in time, I started to realize that that one reason I really liked Sanskrit and ancient languages was because you have this, the way of learning them is often you're kind of studying, memorizing, sometimes chanting the different verb forms and paradigms out loud. And what I realized over the years is the part of Sanskrit tradition that I really, really found interesting was the way you had like texts and manuscripts, but then you also had this kind of living oral tradition that was almost a kind of performance, right? Like when a pundit is doing a ritual or a sutta is, you know, chanting one of the epics or the Puranas or something. There's some kind of performance going on, right? And so that for me was the connection that helped me resolve this conflict, because even though rock and roll is so different from the Veda, let's say, still there was something about this idea of sound and chanting and performance that I really connected with. And so in my case, it took a while to get to that. I got the degree, but then I said, I don't want to be an academic. And for 10 years, I played in rock bands and, you know, I was on tour and put out records and recorded albums in studios. And then only when I was in my early 30s, I thought, okay, I guess I should go find, you know, a more serious career. And so I went back to graduate school. And at that time, I said, I'm going to pick Sanskrit because there's and the Indian tradition, because if you compare it to, say, Homer or Virgil or Greek and Latin, everything's been done, right? Whereas in Sanskrit, traditions and in the study of India and South Asia, there's been so much great work already, but still the tradition is so rich, there's so much new things to do, right? And so that's what led me to do that, and it also led me to focus in my graduate studies on something very few people had ever studied before, which is Samaveda. At least very few people in the West had studied that. So of all the Vedic traditions, Samavedic tradition, this tradition of kind of melodic chanting, let's call it like a ritual song, Gana, as they say in Sanskrit, or stotra, was very interesting to me, and again, gave me this like place to connect my personal passion with the studies I was doing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you the same thing. Like, did rock and roll have any influence on Sanskrit?
Yeah, well, let's talk. It did, but not so. So you asked this question: did rock and roll have any influence? Yes, for all the reasons I just said, right? That this idea of oral tradition, and not just rock and roll. I was also very interested in folk music, in blues music, in all these American musical traditions, where oral traditions are crucial, right? So I'd say the main influence that rock and roll had on my studies of Sanskrit and Indian traditions was that I saw this connection between oral traditions in other places in the world, like in the US or the deep south of America, and oral traditions in South Asia, and I was really, maybe it was a way for me too of saying like, it's more than books. So if you just study Sanskrit through books, you're missing a big part of the tradition, right? And so it was, and as a musician, in that same way, I knew if you took a song by Bob Dylan and you just saw the words, like just out of a book, what would you get? You wouldn't, I mean, the words are genius, they're great words, right? But they're also, in some ways, you'd only have this teeny little picture of what's really happening. And so I knew that from music, and I thought maybe it's the same if you look at other cultural traditions, So that was one point. And the other point actually had to do with something specifically being interested in early Vedic traditions, was that, rock and roll is this tradition in some ways it has aspects of, of kind of this visionary quality, like almost like this state of ecstasy or transcendence that like through the music, you go into a kind of different state of mind, And I realized that when I was looking at early Sanskrit traditions, that rock and roll, we also have our rishis, our sages. We have Jimi Hendrix, we have John Lennon, we have Kurt Cobain. On the hip hop side too, we have all these great rappers like Lil Wayne or Mac Miller. We also have like our rishis. And so I thought to myself, the Vedic tradition is really interesting because you have these rishis and this ancient tradition, and it's about the soma sacrifice. Who knows what soma is? Some people say it's ephedra. Some people say it's magic mushrooms. Some people say it's cannabis. People are always going to be arguing about this. But that's, to me, the identity of soma is not so important. What's important is that the early soma rituals were about achieving a different state of mind. And so I thought, wow, Vedic tradition is everything I like about human culture, right? It's a performance tradition, it's poetry, but it's also about using performance and poetry to enter into a higher state. And so I felt like I could relate to that. Even though the Bijas are so popular, like you see Bijas everywhere, especially being here in Kathmandu, that's one amazing thing, being in Nepal. You have the Buddhist tradition and the Hindu tradition blended, so you get like double mantras, and both Buddhism and Hinduism have Bijas, and both have yoga. So you see them everywhere. But it's a bit strange to say, but maybe because Bijas are kind of everywhere in these traditions, in some ways they haven't been studied so intensively by academics, especially in the past. So we don't know so much. So Bijas, usually we think of them as originating in tantric traditions, especially Shaiva tantric traditions. So maybe 400 or 500 fourth or fifth, fifth or sixth century of the Common Era. But then also there's this influence of Buddhist tantric traditions, right? Vajrayana Buddhism, Mahayana. So these two things are fusing with Bijas from the beginning. But we don't know so much about how they were chanted thousands of years ago. So we just have to study this. And that's one thing we're trying to study in this project. I'm very interested in the origins of bijas and how people use them. Because most of the texts talk about meditating on bijas in this silent way, and not so much about the recitation, especially about the pitch or the volume or the level, you know. So I think it'd be a good project for you to study more of if you continue getting into this. But the other reason I think your suggestion is interesting is because a lot of my research and my dissertation and now the book that I'm finishing this year is on the history of Om. So Om is sometimes called the Adi Bija, right? Like the primal Bija. It's like the Bija to the max. It's the one that all the other Bijas come from. But you can also look at it in a historical way and look at different texts from the oldest to the newest, and you can see that Om actually begins in the Veda, in the Samaveda and the Yajurveda, but especially in the Samaveda. So when I was in grad school, I got very excited because I picked Samaveda to study, and I thought, wow, these are the texts where I find the oldest Oms that have survived, and so even though they don't call Om a Bija, it's still very clear that Om is one of many sacred syllables that are used in early Vedic texts, and these syllables have a pitch to them, right? And that pitch matters in recitation. So your point that the kind of the pitch matters and the volume matters, I think, is an important one, and probably is something that relates to bijas also. And the other thing I would say about bijas and especially Om is that even from reading texts, especially Shaiva Tantric texts about bijas and about Om, there's a practice called uchara, right? That's the ascending utterance. It's when you chant, but uchara means to go up, right? And so in that practice, there's this idea that through chanting Om, the self or the soul, you could say, through the mantra, ascends the body, right? And then reaches the top of the head. So there's this idea, just like you were saying, of moving up from the beginning of the mantra, begins with the sound right, in the back of your throat. And even before that, you have the breath coming from the diaphragm and the belly. And then coming up through the back of the throat, ooh, right in the center, it's a little higher. And then your whole face is resonating as you're saying, Om, right? So there's this idea of going up, and it's in your body. And that idea of going up correlates with spiritual climbing, right? Spiritual rising. So the sound is vertical, but then also the soul's journey is vertical. And then depending on the tradition, you might reach liberation through these mantras in the top of your own body, right? In the head, or, like near the third eye, right? Or maybe in some traditions, there's this idea of even going through the head and even going up to the sun or going to heaven or, uniting with God in some other way. I mean, so I guess one thing I've learned makes me want to push back a little bit on the idea of misconception. Because if you look I think that religion is culture. And so I don't think, even though many religions think of it as a revelation that's always the same and unchanging and has a right and a wrong, from an academic point of view, I look at it more as culture. And so culture is fluid and culture changes. And so for me, if someone's using a mantra and in their tradition and their community, that's the way you use it, I don't want to be in the position of saying like, you're wrong, right? How am I to say that that's a misconception? Because culture changes over time, even though we have these deeply held traditional ideas that seem very much the same. Right? So there's a little bit of this interesting tension between the antiquity of these traditions. They last forever. They've been around for thousands of years. So in some ways they're stable, but then also the dynamism, right? And the way they flow and change, and different people bring different interpretations. One thing I've noticed, if I compare the ancient understanding of mantra to the contemporary understanding, like if I tell my friends that I'm studying mantras, right? A lot of contemporary people think of mantra in the realm of wellness and healing and stress relief. You know, sometimes you hear this. And I don't think that's wrong, but it's a different way of looking at it, you know, because in, let's say, Vedic tradition or tantric traditions or early Hindu or Buddhist traditions, mantras aren't so much about like de-stressing, right? You don't just say a mantra just to like chill out, you know, like it's kind of like a serious thing. It's a matter of life and death. And so one way we're talking about this in our project is that a mantra is a kind of tool of transforming your body and your state of mind. And I think that helps build a bridge between the past and the present. Because I think even people who are using mantras, let's say in like transcendental meditation, you know, like Mahesh Yogi, they're still using it as a tool to transform their state of mind, but they're just talking about like, I'm so stressed and I want to de-stress. Versus in the past, and then in many traditional contexts today, it's a tool for a different kind of goal, right? Maybe you're using a mantra so that the ritual works, you know what I mean? So that you're offering to a bodhisattva or to Buddha or to a deity has power, right? The mantra brings power to the offering. Or maybe you're using a mantra in yoga because you want to kind of advance in your spiritual practice and go on this like vertical path that we were talking about. So I'd say there's a lot of differences between the past and the present, and you can definitely say that something is like more traditional than and something is maybe more innovative, and so that's how I think of it. Well, I mean, if it's a mantra I really like, it would have to be Om, because I've spent I know that's the most famous mantra, but for better or for worse, I've spent the last 15 years of my life, first for my dissertation and now working on this book, thinking I don't really have a mantra practice myself as a spiritual practice, but I always tell my students and my colleagues that I think about Om every day, and I write about Om every day, usually for 4 or 5 hours a day. So maybe that's a spiritual practice in itself, you know. But no, I'd probably like to reflect a little bit on the World Sanskrit Conference and this tradition of bringing scholars together from Asia and Europe and the Americas and around the world, because I think that's a really awesome thing that the World Sanskrit Conference does. And that it's been really great for me to be in Nepal for the very first time, because most of my work, I travel to South India and work with Vedic Brahmins there and their ritual traditions. So I never had a chance to go to the Himalaya and to see Kathmandu and to see Nepal and different parts of the north of the Indian subcontinent. And then also the thing I would like to share is that I arrived and I was at the welcome ceremony, and I felt someone tap my shoulder, and I turned around, and it was one of my Brahmin friends and interlocutors from Kerala who was here, Professor Parvati. And then later I met Dr. Totam Shivakaran Nambudiri, and these are both friends of mine, Nambudiri Brahmins from Kerala. And I just didn't know they were coming to the conference. And so it was so cool to be able to meet them here, because usually we meet and I'm asking them all these questions and, you know, working on my research. But here we got to meet as colleagues and to have a whole different kind of conversation. So that's something I really appreciate.